1,350 empty properties. We dealt with this story back in May when ITV West covered it. Empty properties owned by the Ministry of Defence, or I think actually now owned by some private company. The Ministry of Defence have privatised them too. And we're going to hear now from the leader of Wiltshire County Council, that is Richard Clewer, who is himself a former army officer, talking about what's happening with these 1,350 empty homes, some of which are in devices, as they put in the. And what I'll do is I'll put a link to the clip. And in fact, I'll probably put the clip up on the show page to this ITV report. It's shocking. In fact, maybe before we hear from Martin, there doesn't seem to be any accountability here with the Ministry of Defence. This has been chugging on for years. Some of these properties empty up to 10 years, worth something like £300,000 a piece, empty. And now, obviously, with 10 years of disuse, they're starting to, some of them, become uninhabitable.
Yeah, well, I remember we covered this story some weeks ago, didn't we? It's shocking. I mean, it's just another example of the high-handedness of the MoD, and of course the role of the private sector. They've now farmed off these houses belong to us. The Ministry of Defence is a public institution, but they are basically giving it to a private sector firm to manage. And then, of course, they say, well, there's nothing to do with us now. It's they're managing it, and therefore there's no accountability. They've just been given public property. It's just outrageous, isn't it?
Yeah, it's something called the DIO, the Defence Infrastructure Organisation, but there's no accountability there. They just do what they want. There's also, of course, the fact that these properties are sitting on land. That land may be simply seen in some people's eyes as just a land bank. Those houses, once they start to deteriorate, maybe then they'll have to be demolished, and maybe there'll be an intensive housing estate, maybe 3 stories with some blocks of flats and things put on there. And they're just thinking, well, if we wait long enough and these houses fall down, then we can make a lot of money here. But anyway, let's have a listen to Richard Clewer, the leader of Wiltshire Council, explaining earlier this week to me why we've still got these 1,350 empty homes and nothing's being done about it.
There are always going to be empty properties, and there are properties that are in the process of being done up, and there are others where someone owns them but doesn't want to do anything with them. It's a sort of constantly flexing number, but we've got a big issue in Wiltshire. It's an issue in other parts of the country as well, but particularly in Wiltshire, given our military connection, where we have got about, give or take a couple, 1,350 empty MoD properties. They're outside the wire, so they're out in the community. They're spread all over the place, so there are concentrations in, as you'd expect, Lynham and Tidworth, but they're also in Salisbury and Amesbury, in Devizes and in some of the villages. They have been empty for a long time. We don't know how long. For example, the Devizes ones, it's at least 5 years, probably 7, talking to residents there. And in some areas, you've got sort of concentrations of several empty properties. In others, you've got some that are still in use with military families, some that are empty, and some that the MoD had then rented out to people. Because the MoD don't own the housing, there was all sold to a company called Annington Homes, I think in 1990, maybe 89, somewhere around then, and then leased back to the MoD. So the MoD pay rent on the properties whether they're empty or not. They had then rented some of those out to private tenants, and this first came to light as an issue just after lockdown, or the first lockdown, when the MoD suddenly announced that they were evicting a number of those private tenants at whatever notice. It was a comparatively short notice. When we went out to sort of engage and try and find out what was going on, it was apparent that they said they were evicting those tenants because they wanted to hand that housing back to Annington. There was under the terms of the deal, when the MoD stopped using housing, they can hand it back to Annington, who then sell it on the private market. But they were trying to evict people from properties when there were empty properties next door. It didn't make sense. Must admit, it made me rather cross at the time. These were people who, in some cases, just moved in, many of whom were ex-forces. And so we had a look at it, found out quite how many empty properties there were, made it very clear that we would like, if they came on the market, we could look at buying them, bringing them into the housing revenue account, our council housing stock. But also then, as we've had the refugee crises that have come along, the Afghan scheme and then the Ukraine scheme, we've asked whether the MoD would be able to help housing there, because there's a shortage of housing in Wiltshire. We don't quite have a housing crisis, we have a housing problem. And again, there's been no willingness from the MoD to help with any of that. They've come back to us with a spread of reasons, excuses. We've been told that the property is all being handed back to Annington to be sold. Well, none of it has been. That it's being repaired, that it's needed for urgent redeployment. You don't urgently redeploy families. Urgent deployments tend to be just the personnel, and this is family housing, or that it's needed for standard redeployments. But if you think that roughly speaking, 20% of MoD personnel live in that kind of housing, then if you've got 1,350, then if you sort of extrapolate what that means in terms of redeployment, you're looking at the ability to redeploy thousands, 10,000 or no, I could probably my numbers slightly wrong there, about 7,000 people. And I mean, that's a significant chunk of the army that's based in Wiltshire. The MoD know what its deployments are. At the moment, they're reducing numbers, not increasing them, although the numbers in Wiltshire are probably going to increase slightly. So it just doesn't make sense.
So that's Richard Clewer there, leader of Wiltshire Council, former army officer. Martin, he's making a lot of good points there, isn't he? And I think, in a way, it's like the military, they've got this rather arrogant attitude that because we're the military, you better not try and intimidate us because we've got tanks.
Well, I mean, it's certainly a bit of that, but also I'm very suspicious of the role of this private company. I mean, what if the Ministry of Defence owns all of these houses, why would you want to sell them to a private company? What for? If you could sell them to the local council for council housing, why not? But this insidious, privatisation. Look at it's happening all over the place. Yeah. And land lots of public land has been sold off. It goes on year after year. Public land is sold off into the private sector with no kind of anybody looking at what's going on or who's getting the land or anything. We have a rentier economy in a technical term in this country, where those who own and speculate in land and financial services are being basically looting the rest of the population.
Well, there's a bit of a twist to the tale, because if you go back to Tuesday, the 15th of March this year in the Daily Telegraph, Military Homes row heads to court. Guy Hands files legal claim against the Ministry of Defence to block the re-nationalisation of the £7.6 billion housing portfolio. So what's been happening here is the Conservative government have looked at this whole deal and they've said, well, actually, we think this the privatisation was a bad idea. But Guy Hands' housing firm has launched illegal proceedings against the government to block the renationalisation of its portfolio of thousands of military homes. And it looks like maybe as if these homes in Wiltshire are just part of this kind of legal impasse. Hands' company Annington Homes has begun legal action in 2 courts after talks with the Ministry of Defence over the renationalisation broke down. Annington offered to contribute £150 million to maintain the homes, but was rebuffed by the MoD. He's now launched a judicial review as well as a High Court claim to challenge the MoD's plans. Defence chiefs are trying to use leasehold rights to reclaim homes that were first sold off by John Major's administration in 1996. So that seems to be what's going on here, Martin. The military have realised that Annington Homes and the private people are just a disaster as owners of these places, and they need to have them back, even though they were being told, well, if you privatise them, these company can run them so much more cheaply and efficiently than the ministry can. Well, the answer is no, they haven't, and also they're now starting to look at them as their own private property where they can use to speculate with.
Well, that's right. I mean, I'm glad that the government is deciding to renationalise these houses, but that you can see that the people who've got their hands on them now are determined to keep hold of them, and this has been this kind of creation of vested interest, by using public resources to give to private companies and individuals. This is what Thatcherism is all about.
Yeah, it is. I'll put a link up to the story.
That's in a nutshell. That's what it is.
I'll put a link up to this privatisation, the attempt to renationalise the homes, on our show page at thisweek.org.uk. They've done quite a good job. Helen Cahill, another Cahill, up at the Daily Telegraph here, and she's looked at the way that the housing estate, and there's 57,400 homes which were privatised by Major. Hands apparently brokered the privatisation deal while he was head of the principal financial group at Nomura, whoever they are. He later purchased
bank.
He purchased the properties through his private equity firm, Terra Firma. The portfolio is now valued at 7.6 billion. So I suppose you could call Guy Hands a UK oligarch, couldn't you? The MoD sold off these 57,400 homes for £1.7 billion back then, and they are now thought to be worth 7.6 billion.
That's our money. That money should be in the public domain to be used for public purposes. He's captured it, and that, of course, is the.
Well,
as I said
more
earlier,
than that.
That's the story.
More than that, the government has since been criticised for failing to properly value the homes in the original auction, Martin.
Well, that's right, isn't it? If you sell public property for less than it's worth, and of course that's what happened in the privatisations of the gas industry. Remember Telsyd and all the rest of it? They were sold, and even the shares in the Royal Mail. If you're going to sell public property, you should sell it for what it's actually worth, so that the public gets the full value of its previous investment. But to sell off public property for less than it's worth, or to give it away in order to buy support, this is the story of Thatcherism. And it's the same true of the sale of council houses. If people had to buy them, what the value of the houses were actually worth, most of them couldn't have afforded to buy them. But they were allowed to buy them at much lower than the actual real price of the house. That's a free handout to those people, and a free handout which has turned into be millions of pounds for some of the people involved. Now, they're very happy, and many of them vote Conservative as a result. But that's our money, which should be used for other things.
Well, they have a picture of Guy Hands in this article in the Telegraph, and he's got this kind of weird blank face looking at the camera. Annington has argued that the scheme was not appropriate for use on a large number of homes. So that's what they're doing through the courts. So this is how they're trying to block it, the renationalisation. And also, of course, there will be questions about the original value. But the MoD just wants to get its hands back on this stock because it needs them. And Mr. Hands has embarked upon lengthy legal battles in the past. His ill-fated takeover of music group EMI sparked a legal dispute with Citigroup that lasted 7 years. Citigroup lent Terra Firma, this is his private equity firm, £2.5 billion to fund that deal. Mr. Hands later chased the bank through the courts in both New York and London over allegations of fraud, but he abandoned the £1.5 billion case in 2016. The MoD declined to comment. Well, maybe he's going to have to abandon this case too, Martin, and we can get our military homes back.
Well, it would be nice to see, but of course, the wider issue is that all sorts of public resources have been squandered and deliberately put into the hands of private operators who are basically fleecing us.
Well,
it's been going on for years.
Yeah, not least of which, of course, is the water companies. And we covered this a little briefly. I mean, I think I should be shouting this from the rooftops about the abstraction by the water firms. I interviewed Peter Berenius back in 1992, I think it was, in Salisbury, who was complaining about the levels of water in the chalk streams around Salisbury in Wiltshire, and saying that he'd been living there for 40 or 50 years and he'd never seen them so low over the past 5 years. Well, you do your maths, you go back to 1987. What was happening then? Well, the water boards were being privatised, and it's since the year that the water boards were privatised that the water levels had gone down. We discovered at the BBC in Salisbury it was Wiltshire Sound, it was our Salisbury office, and I think the Salisbury Journal covered it too, that the private water companies had been abstracting massive amounts of water from boreholes from the aquifers that lie under the ground, which is where all the fresh water, because this is a lot cheaper for them to process. If they deal, Martin, the private water companies, with reservoir water and other forms of groundwater, that is, stuff just lying there from rivers, etc., on the surface, then that all has to be treated. And it's quite a pain and expensive for them to do so. But if they're sucking the water up from the aquifers, it's a lot cheaper. And as a result, what they've been doing is lowering water levels right across the country in a way they were never allowed to do when they were water boards. The idea was that these boreholes were sunk in case there were serious droughts, and that they were very carefully monitored, that the water companies had to ask permission, the boards, in order to take water. And now, of course, what we're getting these stories like water scarcity. EU countries are forced to restrict drinking water access. Severe droughts and scarce rain have forced water restrictions in southern European countries. Climate change is making itself felt across the continent, says Deutsche Welle. Well, no, I would say privatisation is making itself felt here in Britain. As we go into a so-called drought, well, I mean, it is a drought. The idea is that we're looking around seeing these rivers being very, very low. The only thing is that the private water companies are doing something similar to the private firm was doing with the MoD homes. They're profiteering with them, and they're taking the mickey.
They are, and also, of course, the pollution levels in our rivers has massively increased, because there was a very good long read in The Guardian last week. This retired police officer and scientist have been they've been carrying out research, and they show that, in theory, water companies are allowed to ditch sewage into the water supply if there's too much rain, but they're supposed to notify every time they do it, and there's supposed to be a system of control. But what they've uncovered is that they routinely dump sewage into the water because they know nobody's ever going to tell them not to. And the motivation for private monopolies like the water companies is always to make profits for the shareholders, rather than how important is water to the rest of the society.
Well, this is why you get
this is why you shouldn't privatise such
things. This is also why the Tories shouldn't do the bonfire of the regulation of all this stuff. We've also got
if you're not going to own it yourself, Martin, you've got to regulate it.
We've also got 600 million litres of drinking water being leaked every day by these companies.
That's because they haven't invested in upgrading their infrastructure.
So, I mean, it's not just renationalisation of the petrol, diesel companies and the gas companies that we should be talking about. It's water too.
Well, water's an obvious one, isn't it? I mean, you can't actually shop around for water. You've got to buy it from the person who sends the water to your tap. And of course, in Scotland, Scottish Water is owned by the Scottish government. And in Wales, the not-for-profit Welsh Water Board is not nationalised, but it's not run but as a private business. In England, we have got the glory of private water, which means we're going to have hosepipe bans and all the rest of it. Meanwhile, the shareholders. The Lib Dems have been saying what we should be doing is saying that the managers of these companies, until they fix what's going on, they shouldn't get any bonuses and all the rest of it. I mean, they should never have been in the private sector in the first place, but they've siphoned off billions of public money because they shouldn't be making any money out of it. But there they are, making all of this money, and of course they've ruined the infrastructure on which everything depends. That's why you don't privatise these things. But tell Margaret Thatcher. She didn't believe in that.
Final item.
Tell Rishi Sunak. He don't believe in it either.